this decision, and just the fact that SCOTUS is hearing the case feels like a win for TikTok. Is that correct?
Maybe. It only takes 4 votes for the Supreme Court to agree to hear a case. I would be very, very surprised if this Supreme Court ends up saving TikTok. I think the decision at the lower court that essentially preferenced national security, the government's national security interests over TikTok's free speech argument. I think that this Supreme Court will end up upholding it. There was a reason why you didn't see the Supreme Court today stay the decision, basically saying TikTok has more time beyond the January 19th deadline that's now in place. That takes 5 votes. I don't think, so they didn't have 5 votes. And so I do think I wouldn't overinterpret this as necessarily a great sign for TikTok.
All right, very, very interesting as well. I do want to get into some of these aspects, and they talk about freedom of speech. Obviously, they're in the First Amendment. What do we make of this argument from TikTok? How strong is it, and could this set a precedent moving forward?
Well, this was the argument that TikTok made in the lower court, that essentially that this law was violating the speech rights of the company and the speech rights of TikTok users. And the court very clearly said, the lower court said, no, actually, that's not true. This is a law that's viewpoint neutral. It's not actually saying TikTok is bad. The problem is that TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance, and that under Chinese law, the Chinese government has control effectively over that company. And that the Chinese government, the PRC, had a goal of what they called manipulating public discourse through TikTok, and that itself was at odds with free speech. So I think in some ways they were saying, look, the principle of free speech was threatened by what the Chinese government could be doing with TikTok. And that was kind of how the lower court looked at this issue. And I think they also noted that TikTok had never sort of squarely denied manipulating content at the direction of the PRC. And that was pretty striking.
Yeah, and that was kind of the whole aspect of this, the national security issue. And how much did we learn about that? Because it didn't feel like there were a ton of foundation of facts in that. It was a threat to national security. That's how they framed it. Does that have to be more well thought out? Does that have to be more vetted in the future?
Well, I think the court was showing a lot of deference to frankly, to Congress in making that decision, and to the administration, the Justice Department, the intelligence agencies who had come forward with that conclusion, and basically said in that lower court decision that it really wasn't them on the role of the courts to second guess that national security concern that Congress and the administration had.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Let's get into also the term as Biden's term's coming to an end. We'll know Trump is in the White House. We did know that the TikTok CEO, ByteDance CEO, was at Mar-a-Lago over the weekend. How might the changing of the guard from Biden to Trump change that, if at all?
Well, Trump flip-flopped on TikTok, right? He used to be against it in his first term, and then he last year flip-flopped at the urging. He had a donor who was one of TikTok's main American investors. He said this week he had a soft spot for TikTok. Ultimately, that doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot, and that's because the way that Congress wrote this law is mostly to be president-proof, either with Biden or Trump. That was by design. They didn't really want to give the president, any president, too much power. And so members of Congress who wrote the bill said, actually, this is on the app stores, Apple and Google, as well as hosting companies like Oracle. It's on them to comply with the law. And actually, last week, we saw members of Congress who wrote the law. They wrote to Apple and Google and they said, hey, by the way, you still have to comply with this. So I think that was a really interesting signal. And these companies are kind of getting buffeted on all sides by different political opinions.
Yeah, a lot of different opinions out there, and a lot of people trying to understand TikTok in its entirety because it's still very much in its infancy. And I do want to attack you because you said you predicted that they will uphold this lower court's decision. Once that happens, if that happens on January 10th or beyond, what happens? Is there any recourse for ByteDance or TikTok moving forward?
Well, this is what's interesting. So under the law, essentially, when January 19th hits, Google and Apple have to take TikTok off their app stores. And keep in mind, this is one day before Trump takes office, right? The law also requires that U.S. companies that might be hosting TikTok services, so this is probably Oracle, maybe other internet services, that they probably can't host them after that date. So it's very likely that Americans won't be able to access TikTok after that date, absent some last minute plan to sell the company, which I think is very, very unlikely. And then, of course, Trump takes office next day. So, I think that then things could change. There's a little bit of a path. It's a very, very narrow path after that, though.
Yeah, it gets even narrower by the day with all these most recent decisions. And I do want to ask you about the divesting aspect of it, because that's what some of the courts have continued to lean on. Do you think that is a possibility? Is ByteDance even considering that option to stay in the U.S. market, to stay relevant? Because if it goes out of the market, like you mentioned, some off these servers, it could change because this moves so very fast. Do you think they might change their tune in terms of divesting?
Well, interestingly, the lower court said, look, TikTok, you've had plenty of time, right, to find a U.S. buyer. They just haven't done it. I think that speaks to the fundamental tension at the heart of this, right, which is that TikTok defenders say, well, it's just this harmless, video app. But then the Chinese government had said, no, this actually is a massive asset for us. Its algorithm is a national asset. We do not want it sold. And that, to me, just kind of undermines the argument that this is some harmless app, right? If the Chinese government cares so much and is going to work so hard to prevent the company from being sold, it really kind of validates the concerns of people who see TikTok as a tool, a propaganda tool for the Chinese government. So from a pure business standpoint, yeah, China should let TikTok be sold to a non-Chinese company. But from a national propaganda standpoint, I'm not sure they're going to allow that to happen. And the fact that they're not kind of tells you all you need to know.
Yeah, that is so very true. So very interesting, as a lot of people still trying to understand TikTok, and then this ban comes into place. But we do know that the Supreme Court will hear this case. That is a big step forward. Adam Kovacevic, thank you so much for giving us some insights and perspective here on Live Now.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right, let's continue on.